on web fundamentals. Oh yeah, thank you. Laser focus on web fundamentals and modern UX to enable you to build better websites. So I want to tell a little story of how I became so interested in Remix. About a year ago, this is what my website looked like. It took me about 15 minutes when I had a cache to redeploy this website. Even if I had like a little typo change anywhere or anything, it took 15 minutes to redeploy that typo change because it was all statically generated. Now my site isn't like small or anything. I've got several hundred pages with all of these episodes of podcasts and my workshops and stuff like that. So there's plenty of stuff on here. But 15 minutes just to fix a typo was a real drag. I didn't like that. The other thing was the user experience was very much a suboptimal one, because when you start with static site generation, you're forced to load all of your data at build time. And if you want something that's a little bit more real time than that, then you have to load that data on the client, which forces you to provide loading spinners. And so on my workshops, when I decided I wanted to have a loading indicator, or not a loading, I wanted to show the tickets that were available. And if we had a discount going on or something, I have to go fetch that from the browser. And so you'll notice that we get this flash of loading workshop details right here when on my old website. And that's where it's hitting a serverless function to go talk to the Tito API and all of that. And it was a bunch of extra stuff. I could go really deep on how Remix makes this way easier to do, but it also makes the user experience much better. I don't like how I had to have a flash of loading state for this. And it's not just me. It's not just like I could make a better skeleton UI or something. This actually has actual negative impacts for users. And as a company that has basically unlimited resources and also a prime directive of performance, YouTube.com has a surprisingly problematic thing here, where they rely solely on JavaScript for their app to be able to run. And one day I was using YouTube and I ran into this bug that like totally shocked me, that they have this problem. And so I recorded it. And what we're going to do is we'll slow down our network to 3G so that we can talk about it as it's happening. And when you go to youtube.com, it's going to send back some HTML from their CDN. And that HTML is just a bunch of loading states. And one of the things that HTML has is a reference to this desktop Polymer JS file that is very, very large. And so on a slower network connection, it takes many, many seconds to download it. And the loading state is completely useless. There are no inputs, there are no images, there's nothing. Because of course they need to know who you are, and they can't do the architecture that they have of putting the HTML on a CDN and do dynamic data. And so when the desktop Polymer finally downloads, then they can render some user specific data. But the problem is that they do render the input, but you can type in there and hit enter and nothing happens except it clears out your search. And this is the bug that I ran into. I was like, what, are you kidding me? What we're waiting for now is this base.js file that is also very large, which adds all of the logic for what happens when you type and hit enter. And so when that finally downloads, that's a 0.5 megabyte of compressed JavaScript. The desktop Polymer was 1.3 megabytes of JavaScript. So you need to download almost 2 megabytes of JavaScript before you can do a search on youtube.com. Just let that sink in. That is nuts. And this is not the web that I know, right? Like the web that I know knows how to handle form submissions. Like that's a thing that we've had since the dawn of the web, or at least the dawn of form. Is you have a form, you have an input, you type in that input, you hit enter, and the web knows what to do with that. But what YouTube has done is they've used JavaScript to break the web. They are not utilizing the web, and they've thrown away the idea of progressive enhancement. And that's kind of sad. And the result is a loading state that is extended period of time, especially on a slow network connection. Now, of course, it gets cached and stuff for future visits, and so it's not all that bad. But wouldn't it be nice if we could have our fast initial loading state, and also like keep in mind that caching only is only useful between deploys. Like if you deploy a new version, the cache is gone now and you got to download. So like you're getting a new version maybe every, however frequently you release, which hopefully is relatively frequently. And so, with basically unlimited budget and a high importance on performance, even YouTube has made this mistake of deciding that we're not going to do anything, make anything work until the JavaScript is loaded, and have this really poor loading experience. And so when I rewrote my website, I decided to use Remix because Ryan and Michael had been talking about it and giving me demos and stuff, and I was blown away by the focus on the web. And what was really interesting to me was that I could do way more than I did with my site. So not only does my workshops page now like actually show the workshops without any loading spinners and stuff. Oh, there's a loading spinner. I can talk about that one here in a second. But it can show like render the actual stuff. I hit refresh and it's really fast. Not only can I do that, but I also realized that, hey, because I'm server rendering, I can actually keep track of the blog posts that you're reading. And at the bottom, I can give you recommendations on other blog posts that you might be interested in that you haven't read yet. So I realized that the heck with HTTP caching, I'm going to make it so I can't use HTTP caching because every single page is different for every user. And when they refresh, every single time you refresh, you get a brand new set of recommendations that are totally different. So this is every time I hit refresh, it's hitting my server. No CDNs involved in this. And it's still that fast. It is no slower than what I had with Gatsby, but Gatsby didn't have those recommendations. There's nothing in here about like what blog post to read next. And again, like this is specific to the user, so it's not going to recommend one you've read already. It'll recommend one that is related to what you're looking at, one that's really popular, and another that's like just totally random. It's pretty cool that I can do that. And there are a lot of things that I realized I could do when I could do dynamic data. And so one really cool thing about server rendering is that it just unlocks a lot of things for you that you hadn't thought of being able to do before. And Remix in particular makes that really easy. So I want to talk about a couple of things with Remix. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, feel free to ask questions in the chat and I will take some time to answer those questions at the end. I'll make sure that we have time for that. So yeah, the big thing that drew me to Remix was like the spinners. I hated spinners and the waterfall. I was just sick and tired of that. I was really excited for that to be done. And so yeah, Remix helps you say goodbye to Spinageddon. But Remix also, because it's your bundler and your compiler and your data fetching library and your router, it can do a lot of really cool things for you. And so as the user is navigating around, we can actually prefetch the data and the CSS and the everything, all the code and everything for the next page that you're going to. This is really important. So React 18 is going to be really awesome because they're enabling us to do a lot of really cool things on the server. And as a part of that, you need to be able to preload all of the stuff that your components are going to be using. Otherwise, you get a really terrible waterfall. And so there's a piece that that React needs to be able to do that. And at Facebook, they have Relay and a compiler and all this infrastructure to make that work. Most of us aren't using that. Most of us don't have that. Remix is that for everybody else. So Remix is really well positioned to take advantage of all the really cool things that React 18 has to offer. And in fact, like we've already been experimenting with it. It was like a 4-line change in Remix, non-breaking change to support really cool stuff that React 18 has to offer. So that's something to look forward to. But Remix uses the platform in a way that no other framework is doing. And I think that is really, really awesome. And that's what enables this basically instant loading experience that even though like when I go to this courses page, I am hitting a server. I'm not hitting a CDN. I'm hitting my server. And look at that, how fast that was. Like I'm going to hit a server. I'm not like server rendering the whole page, but I'm hitting a server to get the data for that page. If I want to go to the Chats with Kent podcast, I'm hitting a server to go get all of the episodes, all the data for that. And like it's instant. I click on the calls, it's instant. The whole thing is really, really fast. And that's because Remix is utilizing the web platform. So that's something that I really appreciate about Remix. Now we're going to do a demo. So we'll talk a little bit about how data loading works here in a little bit in the demo, but there's one other thing, like key thing that I want to show you that we don't have a demo for. So I want to kind of explain this bit because this is huge. So if you've used Gatsby or Next before, you're probably familiar with the idea of file-based nested routing, where you have a pages directory and then you have directories under that, and that all lines up to the URL segments. Remix has that, but we also have layout nested routing, and that is the really killer feature. So file-based nested routing helps a lot with code organization and stuff, knowing where to put what files. And also getting rid of boilerplate as far as like registering different routes and stuff like that. But what layout nested routing does is it actually makes a big impact on the way that multiple teams work on a single project, or multiple developers work on a single project, or even yourself as you're working on different routes of your application. So what layout nested routing says is I've got these URL segments. We have the root of our app. We've got the sales portion here. We have the invoices portion, and then we have the invoice ID portion. And that's all going to be set up in your layout or in your file system. And what's unique about this is that with Gatsby and Next, their pages directory, each one of these may be files, or they may not be. Presumably, these are files of what should be shown to the user when they're at that route. But each one of those files is responsible for the entire UI when that route is active. With Remix, each one of those files exists, but they're only responsible for the portion of the UI that the URL segment is associated to. And so what I mean by that is the root is only responsible for this part of the UI. The sales is responsible for this part of the UI. Invoices is responsible for this part, including that list. And invoice ID is just responsible for this part. So they're all being rendered. In Gatsby and Next, only one of those route modules is being rendered. In Remix, they're all being rendered. And the responsibility for any of these parent routes is to just render the part of the UI that they care about, and an outlet component, which is a React Router v6 thing, an outlet that says, if I have any children, this is where they go. And this has a really big implication. First of all, it allows Remix to optimize things really nicely for you automatically. So as you navigate around different parts of the page, it knows, oh, well, you didn't change the route. You didn't navigate away from the route. So I don't need to go reload the data for that part of the page or re-render that part or anything like that. So I'll just leave that alone and I'll just go load the part that did change. So it's better and faster for the user. But also, as you're developing the application, if you're all the way down at this invoice ID, you have a lot less to think about when developing this piece of the app. It actually, routes feel kind of like developing individual components. And they have their data loading in there. We'll see what that looks like here in a little bit. But what's really great about this is that it means that not only do you only think about the UI that you need, but also the data that you need. And that's really significant. So without layout nested routing, if you're on this invoice ID page, you're not only having to think about the data for your part of the UI, but you're also thinking about the data for your parent and the data for its parent and its parent. And so we typically have these layout routes or layout components that we use, and they accept a bunch of props for the data that they need to render. And then every single page that uses that layout component needs to load that data, which is really annoying, especially over time when the team that's responsible for the route says, oh, we need some additional data now. So let's go tell all of the teams that they need to go load this data, or maybe we'll go update that ourselves. That's an enormous pain. And so what do we do instead? Instead, that's the right thing to do. We should be doing it that way. But instead, what we do is we say, no, let's just load this in the client. We'll put a loading spinner, and then we can co-locate our data requirements with our components that require them. And then all of our users don't even have to care about it. It doesn't even matter. And that's a lot easier, but that now your user experience is worse. And so this layout nested routing has a really big impact on teams working on the same project, or even an individual team working on the project with different engineers over different parts. As you're thinking about each component that you're working in, you can focus on the UI and the data requirements of that particular part of the UI. And yeah, that also has implications for error handling. And so each route can have a special component that you export that says this is what gets rendered if there's an error here, and we can render contextual errors. And you've probably heard of error boundaries with React. This has been a feature for a long time, but you may not know that React error boundaries don't work on the server render. And so if you have an error in the process of server rendering your React app, then the whole thing blows up. And typically what we end up doing is we'll render the header and we'll render the footer. And in the middle, we'll put a little koala with a tear running down its face that says, sorry, I messed up. And like, the little monkeys are working on it, or whatever we end up doing, because we can't show them contextual errors. But because Remix has nested layout routes, we're able to give you contextual error boundaries that work on the server as well. And this has like business implications too, because when you can give a contextual error, then the user can say, oh, well, it looks like this particular invoice is busted, but I can still go around to these other invoices or the other pages. And so when I report a support ticket or something, instead of saying the app is busted, I say this particular invoice is broken. And that saves like that's business value right there. Like that saves you a lot of triaging time, and it's also just like much better for the customer, where they say, oh, well, I didn't even need that invoice anyway, or whatever, whatever the case may be. So layout nested routes, like, do not underestimate this. It is a huge feature of Remix. Okay, cool. So let's get into our demo. The demo that we've got is this notes app. It's pretty simple. I can type in 1, 2, and 3, and then I can delete and delete and delete and delete. Okay, that's it. That's all that it does. And so the way that it works is we have our app directory here, we have routes, and we have notes TSX. So we're on the notes route right here. And so this is what's going to get rendered. But remember, we actually also have a root TSX. So you're responsible for rendering everything between the opening and closing HTML tags. So you get a lot of responsibility there, which is quite nice. You don't need a underscore app TSX file or anything like that, because you're responsible for the whole HTML document. In fact, you're even responsible for responding to requests for the page. So you're sending the response with the whole HTML. You're the one rendering to string. So you want to, pipe to node stream or whatever, that's your deal. You got to figure out how to do that, which of course is not all that difficult. But there's no API for that, is my point. And then even as far as hydrating in the browser, you're responsible for that as well. So there's no API for that. There's a convention for a file that happens to get run in these different contexts, but there's no API for it. So anyway, the root, all it's rendering is our HTML with our body, a div, and then this outlet component. And then when we're on the notes page, Remix makes sure that this component gets rendered within that outlet. And so the default export of the notes page is this component that's rendering a couple forms and our data here. So let's talk about first the data, loading data on in a Remix site. Excuse me. So actually, let's start here. So we're using, oh shoot, I need to fix this. You can ask me about this later. So we're using this hook called use loader data. And use loader data comes from Remix, and it's going to give us our data. You'll notice there's no like if not data, then render spinner or anything like that. The data is always there. As soon as your component's rendered, you got the data. So you don't need to worry about whether or not the data is there. You don't need to check for errors because we have an error boundary thing that we can use instead. So totally different code path for errors. Your happy path stays happy. And so that drastically simplifies the mental model for what you're building. And so then we take our data notes and render based on that. So this data, though, like it's not coming out of nowhere. It needs to come from somewhere. You tell Remix where to get this data. And that is going to be in a function that you export from your route module called a loader. And this loader receives the request. And this is an HTTP fetch request. So if we dive into that and dive into request, then you notice this fetch API interface represents a resource request. So this is a web fetch API that you're learning as you're using Remix. So one thing that people really like a lot about Remix is that they feel like they spend more time on the MDN docs than they do in the Remix docs. And that, I think that's awesome. That's one of the things that appealed to me about React so much, was I felt like the more I used React, the better I got at JavaScript, as opposed to AngularJS. The more I spent in AngularJS, the better I got at AngularJS. And I had to leave all that behind, and I did not like that. So I really like that the request that you get is a web fetch request. So go to the MDN docs to figure out how to deal with that. And so then here we're getting the user ID. We get the notes from Prisma, which is talking to our database, and then we return JSON. So a couple of cool things I want to point out about this. First of all, this piece runs only on the server. That's it. You do not send any of this code to the browser. So we talk about React Server Components. We're really excited about React Server Components because they're going to pull a bunch of our data loading into the server. And when React Server Components was announced, I was really confused why I wasn't so excited about it. Because I'm always excited about new things that React comes out with. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I don't have the problem that they solve. I mean, there are some situations where it might make sense, even in a Remix app, and we're well situated to take advantage of it when it does come out. But right now, you can already move so much of your code for data loading over to the server because the loader runs on the server, and Remix is responsible for communicating across the network. For most frameworks, they leave that responsibility to you. And that is where most of the complexity of building a web app comes from, is dealing with that network connection. Remix manages the entire network connection for you. And that is huge. That saves you a ton of work. And it also allows you to just write your code on the server, which means that you can talk directly to your database like I'm doing here. You can use private API keys and not worry about leaking those to your users. You don't have to make a serverless function over here that your app is calling into. You literally just can write it all right here. Now, if you want to separate it, sure, it's JavaScript. You like call a function. It's no big deal. But it's really nice to be able to have that connection right here rather than the indirection of a serverless function URL that you have to point to. So that's really, really cool. I really like this feature. The other cool thing, talking about this further, is like you can use fetch, you can use GraphQL, you can like whatever you want to. It's all right here. We polyfill fetch for you, so you can just use fetch. And GraphQL is a very large library. So people who are saying, oh, we'll save so many bytes by not data overfetching, and they bring in GraphQL, which is like 150 kilobytes. It's like, I'm sorry, you're probably not saving that much because you're bringing in this enormous library, and it's not just a library you need to load, but also like parse and evaluate. And then so the cool thing is you can continue to use GraphQL if you want to, but it's all running on the server, so you don't have to send those bytes to your users. So that's cool. That's the loader. Let's talk about data mutations. That's not something that most frameworks even handle at all. They just say like, do whatever you do for make a fetch and an on submit or something. So first of all, we've got this logout button. Now, it might be unusual for some of you to see this form wrapping this logout button that's a submit button. In fact, lots of you might make that a link or something, which is very normal thing to do. But what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, the way that mutations have always worked on the web is through forms. And so that's the way we're going to make all of this work. And even a logout, logout is a mutation of the session. So that's how we treat it, and that's how we model it. And so there is no like on submit that you do. I mean, of course you can if you need to, like for analytics or something. There's no on click that you do for your submit button. You just say, hey, Remix, this is going to do a mutation, and I want you to post to the logout route when this is submitted. And so then you come over to the logout route, and this has an action that handles this action. So action, that again makes sense. And so when a form is submitted, this is going to get handled, and we're going to log out the request. So all this does is it sends a redirect to the login, and it sets the cookie to like get rid of the cookie. That's how we, because we're using cookies for authentication in this app. Authentication in this app, by the way, is less than 100 lines. The entire thing hand rolled by ourselves with a database, 100 lines of custom code. I think that's pretty sweet. And all that Remix gives you is a nice way to interact with cookies. So yeah, lightweight abstractions, very easy to modify code. I think that's cool. Okay, so and yeah, and actually that was, I just noticed John's comment in the Zoom, and yes, this is also important. You don't want to do mutations without doing a post request. If you do mutations on a GET request, then you could actually open yourself up to cross-site request forgery attacks. So that's important that we do it this way. So we've got another form here. So this is also a post, but there's no action. And the way that the web works is if you don't have an action on a form, it will post to the current URL, whatever route you're currently at. So that's what we do. And we have an action defined on this route. But keep in mind, we do have 2 forms on this route, and both of them do not supply an action. And so you need to disambiguate those. And the way that you do this on the web is you have your submit button have a name and a value, and that becomes part of your form. That's one of the values in your form data when your form is submitted. And so here we say, if the user clicks on this button, the action is create note. And if they click on this button, the action is delete note. And then on the notes, we've got multiple delete buttons. So the way we disambiguate between which note we want to delete is through a hidden input. So those of you who've been doing PHP for like years or whatever web stuff for years, you're gonna be like, yeah, of course, this is the way we've always done it. But for those of you just out of a boot camp in the last 6 years, you're like, what the heck? And here's what the heck. It's declarative, and it's really nice to be able to do things this way. There's like, you'll notice what I'm not doing. All of that on submit, event prevent default, fetch JSON stringify my thing, or you're going to use Axios or React query, like all of that stuff you don't need to do, because this all works out of the box with the way the web works. And so that is how that's how this works. So then our action gets the request, we determine the user, we get the form data out of the request. And again, this is web fetch API, so you can get a form data out of a request. Fancy that. And then we get our action type. And if we want to delete the note, then we get the note ID out of the form data. We delete it. If we want to create a note, we can do all of our validation and whatnot. And again, like this all runs on the server. So React 18, they're trying to get your data fetching, so getting data out of the client and into the server, but they're not doing anything about your mutations. In Remix, we also move your mutations off of the client and into the server. And so all of your validation and stuff, like you've got to have validation on the server. You have to. That's like your baseline, because clients can always work around your client-side validation. They can curl your site. And so you've got to have validation on the server. And so we just move everything over to the server. Now, of course, you can add validation to the client, so you get like real-time validation as they're typing and whatnot. But the baseline is like, let's put it on the server. And the fact that it's all in one file just makes it so easy to maintain. Yeah, it's awesome. You really come to appreciate this when you start working with a bunch of Remix apps. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of changes that we want to make. So the last couple of things I want to talk about here today are what does it feel like to make changes to an existing app? What is progressive enhancement, and what does that mean for Remix apps? Yeah, and how can we enhance our own experience to make it awesome? So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, you know what? There are no pending states in here. And so I'm an engineer who's been working on this, and I'm going to say, I need to go on vacation. I don't have time to add pending states. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say reload document. So what this is going to do is it's going to say, even if there's JavaScript on the page, I want this to do the same thing that the web has always done. We're not going to prevent default. We'll let the default behavior happen. And so this is going to do a full page refresh the way JavaScript has always worked. And so now if I go 1 and I hit save, you notice like I get a full page refresh when I do that. When I delete, I get a full page refresh. You'll be able to see that a little bit easier if I slow things down. So new note, hit save. We get a favicon spinner right here. And here's the cool thing is that worked. And I actually get a loading state for the users. And in fact, because of the way that Remix has architected this, I can actually disable JavaScript. Let's say that JavaScript failed to load for some reason. I misconfigured my server, and I can go over here and say we're on slow 3G even, and this is sweet. And the app still works. I still get a loading indicator just because the way the browser works. And I still actually like it is successful. So this is the difference between YouTube and Remix is that YouTube uses JavaScript to enable the experience and Remix uses JavaScript to enhance the experience. Now we don't want like a full page reload. That's not great. I mean, we don't want, who wants that? Not me. But the experience works at least, and then we can use JavaScript to make that experience better. And so that's what we're going to do. Let's say, hey, coworker, we've got the mockups for and the designs for what the loading state should be. And it's really not that hard to add loading states to Remix anyway. So you're not going on vacation until you've actually implemented those loading states. So let's go do that. Because Remix is managing all the network tab for you, all you have to do is hook into the state and say, hey, Remix, what's the current state of the network for these form submissions? And then you render based on what the current state is. So what we have in Remix is a hook called use transition. This is not a React 18 use transition. That's not released yet. We got there first. But so this transition is using what we call the transition manager to tell us what current state we're in and some information about that state. So we're going to use that transition to know whether or not we are currently saving. And when you submit a form, you are actually navigating. You're making a transition when you submit a form on the web. And so based on that, we can say, hey, if the transition that I'm experiencing is a submission, a form submission, and the form that is being submitted has an action that is a create note action, then I know that I'm saving. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to say is saving transition submission form data get action create note. So I know that I'm in a saving state if that's the case. Otherwise, I'll just say save, and we'll also do a disabled on is saving. And that's it. Now I've added a loading state to my app. Ta-da! There's no use effects. Like, look at all the things there are not that you don't have to do. No dependency list, no use memo, no use callback, none of that stuff. You've got to use transition to just say, hey, Remix, you're managing the network chasm for me. Tell me what the current state of that thing is. And now I can say, hey, if the transition that's happening right now, it has a submission and that submission form data has an action, then tell me if that's create note. And if it is, then I know that the transition that's happening is because they're submitting this. And so now I can go over here. Let's reload this with JavaScript now, because we're enhancing our experience, right? And I'm going to say new thing and hit save. And it's not going to work, of course, because I screwed something up. Let's figure out what I did wrong. Dang it. Something messed up. Let's try this again. Whoops. So slow 3G. Hello. And I hit save. Did I save this? What gives? Okay, hold on a second. I'm not sure what I messed up. I've given this demo like 100 times, so I'm not sure what I did wrong. It's probably something stupid. I promise it works. Remix works, by the way. Okay, let's just console log our. I must have spelled something wrong actually. Form data get action create note. No, that's right. Let's go transition. We'll just console log our transition. So we're debugging live, folks. Okay, so we started in an IL state, then I go blah. Is the return value from use transition a function? No, it's not. Thanks. Anyway, though. So I hit, I know what it is. I still have reload document on all of these. So we are reloading the entire page, and I didn't notice that this spinner. Okay, so get rid of that. We are not going to reload anymore. We are progressively enhancing this experience. Okay, there we go. So now it's going to work. This works. And we'll throttle it so we can watch it. We hit save. And now we've got a contextual loading state that was designed, and it looks amazing, and a much better experience. We've taken what we had before. It worked before. We progressively enhanced it to work better. And that's what you use JavaScript for. That's like the entire whole JavaScript thing is make the app better. Baseline as it works, you make the app better. And you can make it better really easily when you have a framework that is managing the network chasm for you. Okay, so let's do the same thing for the delete button. So I'll come down here, just copy all this stuff, and we can say is deleting. In this case, though, we have multiple delete buttons, so we need to disambiguate. Okay, I know that my transition is happening because of a delete note action, but is it this one that I'm deleting? And so we're going to add another thing right here to say whether the submission that we are experiencing, is a note has the note ID of the one that we're currently rendering. So that's why the form data has the note ID, is because it's part of the form that's being submitted. So if we have a form ID or a note ID that is the same as the one that we're rendering, we know that we're deleting this one. And so now I can say disabled is deleting, deleting, or delete. And that's it. I've added a loading state to that form also. And so if I go delete, then I'm going to get a delete ... And it looks awesome. And it's nice and contextual. I don't lose like my focus, or I can manage my focus better than like on a full page reload. So that works really nicely. So now I'm going to do like one last thing, or I want to talk about one last thing, and then we can get to any questions that y'all got. So when you submit a form, or when you click on a link, or anything like that, you are telling the browser that you want to go somewhere. That makes a lot of sense for clicking links, but you may not have known that. But when you submit a form, you are telling the browser you want to go somewhere. That's the default that you're preventing when you say event prevent default. And in a lot of cases, that makes sense to do that. Like if we're creating an Airbnb and we like uploaded our photos and stuff, we hit save, and it's going to take us to the preview page, or maybe we're submitting it and it's going to take us to the final page. Like that's the mutation that makes a lot of sense to transition over to that thing. But there are a lot of situations where transitioning to a different URL doesn't make a lot of sense. Like in this case, for example, we're staying on the same page. We're just like making a mutation on this page in this context. If you go to Twitter and you want to favorite a tweet or something, what are the downsides of remix run? I could tell you about that later. But I'll just favorite this without even reading it. It's not going to navigate when I click on that, right? It doesn't make sense. So there are some situations where it makes a lot of sense to navigate, other situations where it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so the default for the web is always to navigate when you do a form submission. And if you watch closely as you're like going around on the web and you click on a link and then you click on another one, you say like, never mind, I want to go to this one. You'll see that the browser actually cancels that request that you submitted. The same thing happens for forms. You submit this form and then you submit another form that without JavaScript, if you're doing like a regular web thing, the browser will cancel the previous form. And so that's what Remix simulates. Remix does the same thing by default. The global form and the global use transition are for managing those global transitions between pages and stuff. But if you want to have something that's like, I'm only on this page and I don't want to like redirect the user to anywhere else, and then you're going to use a very similar mental model, just a slightly different hook, different API. So I want you to watch this closely because we're making actually a pretty significant change without having to change a lot of our code. So first of all, I started out modeling this as a transition, but then it turns out like, oh, this doesn't make sense as a transition. So instead of redirecting, I'm just going to do this for the delete case because It's to save on time, but you'd probably want to do this for the create node case too. But instead of redirecting, I'm actually just going to return a response that's like, okay, or whatever. Like if I wanted to, I could maybe return something else, but you do need to spell it right. Doesn't work if you spell it wrong. Okay, so we're going to return this response. It's like, it worked, hooray. And then over here, instead of use transition, I'm going to use a different hook called use fetcher. And I'm going to rename this to fetcher. And you'll notice that TypeScript isn't yelling at me about this. And that's because fetcher and transition have the same API. So a fetcher can have a submission, and it can also like have all the different loading states as well. You get like really fine-grained control over these, the different things that it's doing throughout the loading state process too. So the final thing is that when you're using a form that does a full transition from one URL to another, and so that's why use transition hooks into the form. With a fetcher, you're not making that transition, and so instead of using the global form, we're going to use the fetcher form, and that's it. I'm done. I've completely changed the way that this works. It's no longer transitioning, but the mental model is still exactly the same. I'm still mutating with forms. I'm still, that network chasm is being managed for me by Remix. And now my experience is much better. And actually, you know what? Before I forgot to show this. Here, let me back up just a little bit because I forgot to show you one of the problems with modeling something as a transition. And there are a couple other things I want to talk about here as well. So I'm going to delete all of these. I want you to watch closely what happens in the network tab as well as in the loading states when I do this. So we're back to use transition and regular form. So if I delete and delete and delete, you notice only one of them is showing that it's being deleted at a time. And then you'll notice that when it's all done, the right thing happened. I said, hey, delete all of these. And the right thing, they all got deleted. So like, we don't have a bug. We have a suboptimal experience, which, I mean, is that a bug? Yeah, probably. Like if you log this in Jira, you log it as a bug, but it works. Like the functionality is correct. It's just not a great experience, and we can make that better. But what's really cool is Remix is keeping those resubmissions canceled so that the browser ignores the response. Because if you are making multiple submissions, you don't care about what the server sends back, because whatever the server sends back, it's wrong because the user's not doing that anymore. And so Remix, this is what I mean when I say that Remix manages the network chasm for you. It completely does, and it's awesome that it manages that for you. Race conditions as well. If one of these happened to go on a weird route around China or something to get to your server, and so the second one came back first, and then the first one came back, whatever, Remix will manage all that for you too. So that's really cool. You end up in the correct state. You don't have to manage any, like, did you see Redux in here? No, because you don't need to manage state. Remix is managing that state for you. That's sick, my friends. That is so nice. The amount of code you don't have to write is just amazing. Okay, but the like delete thing, that was weird. That doesn't make sense for this UI. So that's why we're gonna restore the use fetcher thing. And now if let's no throttling, we'll do 1, 2, and 3. And now I slow us down so we could watch this. And we delete, and they all get deleted, and it works awesomely. And the mental model is still the same. And I just think that is so cool. One last thing I want to mention is when you are on Twitter and you say, like, hey, actually, this is a test. And then I go over here, and then I'm going to go back to my profile, and I'm going to go delete that. This is a test. And now I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to hit the heart. Okay, here, actually, let's slow down the network so we can see this. So it says that it was favorited, right? And then it says, sorry, that tweet has been deleted. So this, you know what this is called? This is called optimistic UI. We're optimistic that this is going to work. So let's go ahead and just say it worked. And then when we find out, after we like try to like that tweet, when we find out, oh, oh, that was deleted, whoops. And we'll roll it back. We'll say, never mind, that doesn't work. And this is pretty common UI pattern that leads to, like, it's a really awesome user experience. I'd much rather have it show the state in the 99% case where it actually is going to be successful, then for me to have to wait for it to respond to me clicking the like button. And this is a very difficult pattern to implement traditionally in JavaScript applications. I've done it in Backbone, Angular, React, and with React Query as well. React Query was the easiest by far. That like all of those others were really, really hard to do that rollback. Like the optimistic UI is typically like relatively straightforward, but rolling back when your optimism was misplaced, that is really tricky. React Query made that quite a bit easier. Remix just totally takes the cake. Watch this. This is going to blow your minds. If is deleting, return null. That's it. I'm done. That's optimistic UI. It cracks me up. So watch this. Oh my gosh, this is so nuts. So I'm going to say if math.random. So we're going to fail some of these. Then yeah, we'll return a new response. I could talk about throwing responses later, but failed to delete note for some random reason. Something broke. I don't know what. It doesn't matter. And we're gonna no throttle, so we can make 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so at least one of these hopefully will actually fail. Okay, so I'm gonna delete. Oh, whoops. Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. I fooled myself. There's no loading state anymore. So yeah, they're just gone instantly. And then when the server's like, oh, by the way, that didn't work, they get restored. It's magic. It's so simple. It really is. You look at your code and you say, oh, well, if we're in a deleting state, then I don't want to render this anymore. And that's it. And then it turns out, oh, it's not in a deleting state anymore, and it still happens to be in my data. So let's render the thing. Find me a framework that makes it this easy. Even your Svelte magic with your DSL can't do it this easy. It's so great. I'm not trying to be antagonistic or anything. I'm blown away. Like when I saw this, I was like, holy fetch. Now, not every case is going to be exactly this easy. Like one thing that you'll notice is when I delete all of them, it's not saying that there are no notes. So there is some extra work that you need to do to say, okay, we need to do optimistic UI for this as well. But I imagine you could figure out how to, well, I know how I would do that, but you could figure out how to make that work as well. And it's going to be basically the same sort of story. Yeah, this thing is sick, and I'm here for it, my friends. And that's why I left my lucrative job as a full-time educator to come over to work for Remix, because I realized all I want to do is teach people how to build Remix apps, because this is mind-blowing. And that's all I have for you. So thank you so much for giving me some of your time. I'd love for you all to speak at Remix Meetup next week. Also, if you haven't heard, we have a conference coming up at the end of May. And so feel free to, in the chat, if you're coming, raise your hand, because I would love to meet you there. And it's going to be so awesome. So please do come. We've got some really cool speakers. It's going to be a really good time. Companies, we have 3 slots open for other companies to sponsor. So if you want to, I think it'd be pretty cool to sell out sponsorships. So so if you want to sponsor as well, then you'll get free tickets to come to the conference too. So get your company to sponsor. Okay, that is it. I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got for the next little bit.
Woo. I don't know if everyone wants to come off mute, but that was awesome. That was so much. We got some questions in the chat as we go through those. Anybody have one they want to ask directly while we're looking through these?
Let's see. Okay, yeah, I'm looking at this question from Michael, who I think may have left already, but I'll look at it anyway. Does Remix enforce not doing bad practices like mutation on the GET requests that is discussed, or just conventions to keep you from doing that mistake? No, so Remix can't really enforce that because you're inside of your loader, and you're like, delete many. Like Remix can't do anything to enforce that. And there's definitely some situations where it actually makes sense. Like for example, if you have some sort of way to track when the last time a user visited the site, that's going to happen on a GET, right? So the user comes to the page and you update some record that says the last time they visited the site was this time. So like there's some situations where mutations on gets are totally fine. So no, Remix doesn't do any sort of enforcement like that. Okay. Yeah, John, you're getting some .NET MVC vibes. That is pretty typical. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, I remember back in the day we used to do it this way. So yeah, a lot of folks similarly really seem to like that a lot. So and Michael also asked if there's a linting tool that suggests custom error boundaries for Remix routes, or is it impossible to know specific requirements? Yeah, so you think about the one thing that I didn't mention on here is when we're talking about error boundaries, they actually bubble up. And so like it makes a lot of sense to put one right here, but maybe it doesn't make sense to put an error boundary right here or something. Business requirements are going to be different. And so it kind of depends on the situation. So no, there's not any linting rules, but there's nothing stopping you from making your own if you wanted to. But we do have an ESLint plugin or config. We don't have any custom rules right now, but eventually I expect we probably will. I don't know what we put in there, but I mean, that's like the inevitable. Everybody, eventually they're going to write linting rules for something. And like within like custom linting rules is pretty common within companies too. So, okay. John asked, is in a server render, the error goes in the outlet. Where does the error go with use transition? Yeah. So if you've got a use transition, so the app is hydrated and then there's an error right here or something, that will go in the error boundary as well. Pretty much anything within the context of your route, even stuff that happens in your loader or in your action, which all happens server side, if any of that errors, then you're going to get your error boundary. Which I think is pretty cool. Now, if you have like a on click here and this thing throws an error, that is not going to touch your error boundary. You will have to manage like propagating that up to your error boundary yourself, which is pretty straightforward actually. Here's how you do it. Error. So you've got that, and then you say try catch, and then set error, and then you say if error throw error, and now it's in your error boundary. That's it. And actually the package that I maintain called React Error Boundary has a little hook that does this really nicely for you if you want to use that. So that is that. Let's take a look at the next question. Use transition. Oh, yep. Thank you. All that is good. Okay. Sweet. Taylor's asking, is it possible to use micro front-end architecture with Remix? You talked about teams using nested routing. Yeah, it's so interesting. Whenever I talk about using Remix and how great Remix is for teams, this question always comes up. So people are like super into micro front-ends because they're like, teams, micro front-ends. Like you cannot have an app that is built by a team or multiple teams without micro front-ends. I've got news for you. You can, and Remix will make it way easier. And so you can use Remix with micro front-ends if you want to, and people are working on that. But I would strongly advise against starting with a micro front-end with Remix, because you're going to be very surprised how little you run into those problems that micro front-ends solve. And so in particular, like a lot of people cite the being able to deploy independently as like a reason to do micro front ends, or being able to have your own package JSON for each individual app. If those things are total requirements for you, then yeah, micro front ends would make sense. And you can use some of the tools that people are working on to make that work. But there are really good reasons to not have individual package JSONs. Being able to share code across these different boundaries and stuff like that. For performance reasons and stuff. And so Remix makes it so you can get way further before you run into the other problems that micro front-ends are supposed to solve. So yeah, there is no support for Webpack Module Federation currently, but we have a member of the team who worked on Webpack Module Federation a fair bit, and so like maybe in the future, but it's not currently a planned feature or anything like that. And like I said, in the community, there are people working on this problem as well. Okay. Bill is asking, with Remix, can we still use hidden form fields? Any advantage to using hidden form fields with Remix? Well, I think maybe you missed it, but we're literally using it right there. So yes, with Remix, you totally can. So hopefully that answered your question. I didn't misunderstand. Carl, and you use hidden form fields a lot more frequently in Remix because like it's the web now, instead of just doing your own fetch thing. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that all of this still works without JavaScript? Yeah, that's pretty sick. It's so cool. Okay, Carl's asking, what is giving the great code assist? So that is GitHub Copilot. Go look that up. It's pretty cool. Okay, and Eric, on the team's micro front ends, how would you see a team bring in Remix to an existing giant enterprise React app? Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So there are a couple of approaches to this. One is, and like if it's really a giant enterprise app sort of thing, this is probably the most straightforward. So you've got your app running over here, and then you start building, like rebuilding one of the routes or one of the features. Like one of the teams decides they're going to carve off their piece, and they're going to re-implement that in Remix. You do it as small as you like or whatever, even a single route in Remix. And so then you have an Nginx server that's responsible for your load balancer or whatever. You have some server that decides where to send different routes to which servers. And you just update that to say, for this route, send it over to the Remix app. And then you slowly just eat more and more and more into the Remix app until the whole thing is Remix. And that's the most straightforward thing for like a large enterprise app. Other approaches though, oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, a really common question that we get is, what about Remix versus Next? Like, what's the difference between Remix and Next? We've got a very detailed blog post that you can go take a look at. The TLDR is Remix is better in every way. So go take a look at that if you don't believe me. Sorry, I'm being a little cheeky, but like read the blog post and you'll see I'm almost being serious. Yeah, so if you wanted to migrate from something like Next, one of our community members is doing that, and he's actually got Express serving both Remix and Next, and he's got it handling basically sort of like the Nginx thing, where some routes are handled by Next and some are handled by Remix, and then just slowly moving it over. And then from create React app sort of thing, like it's all client side rendered, you're using React Router. We are in the process of making a really nice package that will allow you to very easily upgrade to React Router v6. And when you're at React Router v6, and soon we're actually bringing in a ton of what Remix is into React Router v6. And so you start using all of those features, and you can very easily incrementally migrate over time. So we'll have a really nice path for anybody who's using React Router in the future. Okay, cool. So why is Remix now available for free? Yeah, so yeah, we got venture money. Yeah. So originally Remix was a paid framework. That's when I jumped on board and as like a user of Remix. And I thought it was actually great. I liked the idea that the more users Remix got, the more funding Remix got. Like it seemed like the incentives were aligned well, but turned out that the Remix team, Ryan and Michael, just decided, you know what, like this isn't going to work the way that we want it to. We want to reach as many people as we can. It's not just about making money for us. And so we're going to open source this so we can reach everybody. And then we'll find a way to make money. And so convinced some venture capitalists to give them some money. And then they hired a team, including me. I joined on as director of developer experience in November, just like 2 weeks before they went open source and V1. And yeah, we've got a bunch of plans to make this a sustainable company. that I'm not going to tell you about because like, it's going to be great. It's going to blow your minds. But I'm not sure if we're ready to tell what we're planning on, but it's going to be really, really great. Okay, Taylor's asking, how difficult is it to position a remix application in front of an existing backend application? Oh, dude, are you kidding? This is so great. Check this out. So you go in your loader and you're like, return, fetch my HTTPS, like my thing, whatever, .com/whatever you want. That's it. You're done. and same thing on your action, return, fetch, you know, here's my body, my request body. Like here's my method is a post or a put or a delete or whatever you want. Like it couldn't be easier. My site, I'll just undo everything, I guess. My site is uses like 15 services that are like third-party APIs. And so, yeah, where am I? Right here. So this uses the Tito API for getting workshops. This uses the Simplecast API for getting all of these podcasts. In fact, I even use Transistor. This one's Transistor. I even use the Transistor API to create new episodes from my website, which is pretty sweet. And this one uses the Simplecast API. Yes, I have 2 podcasts, and yes, they are using 2 different podcast providers because I didn't want to migrate. Transistor's better. So if you want to make a podcast, I like Transistor better. This actually uses Discord API to connect to your Discord account. The blog posts, this uses the GitHub API. Like I'm hitting APIs up the wazoo. And like, it's so great. It's so awesome. And it's so fast. Like, so the GitHub API is not fast. It's not fast enough for what I'm doing. And on top of that, I'm also compiling MDX and stuff. That is not fast. So I'm sticking a Redis cache in front of that to make it like, that takes 5 milliseconds to pull it out of the Redis cache. And so, yeah, like even if you have a slow backend, you can make your site seem outrageously fast with a simple cache in front of it. And so that's what I've done. And so, yeah, there you go. Crazy easy. It's outrageously easy. And one group of folks are migrating their Create React app to Remix, and they've got a Create React app front end, and then I think it's a Django backend. And then they're rewriting all of their UI to Remix, and then over time they're going to rewrite their Django into Remix as well, and then it'll all just be Remix. A lot of benefits to that, but you absolutely don't have to do it that way. And in fact, you could actually do the opposite too. You could rewrite your backend to Remix and then migrate your UI. That like Remix is like a better Express, like because it handles all the routing for you and stuff too. And what's really cool is it normalizes all the platforms. So you're like, I'm deploying on Heroku today, but I want to get over to serverless somehow. Well, first rewrite your app to Remix, run it in Node on Heroku, and then you can move it over to a serverless architecture, just like boom, and it's done. I mean, of course, now you have to live within the constraints of serverless, but you'd have to do that with a rewrite over the serverless anyway. So you rewrite your app to Remix, then you get rid of all of the node things that like need a persistent volume and stuff like that. Get rid of all that, make it so that it would work in a serverless environment. And then boom, you're on serverless. Like, wow, that's neat. So there you go. Question from Andre about, can you tease anything about what's changing with loaders and action code moving from the Remix to React Router? Yeah, okay. So the loaders and actions, this piece and this piece are not moving to React Router because those are server-side pieces. But we are going to allow you, because you're the one responsible for rendering your routes with React Router. So we are going to allow you on a route to say, to provide a loader and an action. That will all be client side. Well, actually, I wonder, I think it will probably work server side as well. I'm not working on that, so I'm not sure. But now that I think about it, it might run server side too, possibly. But yeah, so you'll in a Create React situation, Create React app situation, which are all client side, that will just you'll have a function where you say, this is how I load data for this particular route. And so as you're migrating, you make all your routes work that way, and then you add a loader and an action and everything over to those individual routes. You move all your use effects spaghetti over into those things. And then you install Remix and you move that chunk of code into the loader. And now all of a sudden it's running on the server, and only on the server, and Remix is managing the network chasm for you. Eric's saying, for other framework support, what are the next frameworks you're seeing getting Remix support after React? So it'll be Preact first for sure. That's the easiest, naturally. But we also have a member of the team who is really into Vue a lot, really likes Vue. He wrote a Vue mix that he was just playing around with. I don't think it's like a real project anybody's using. But yeah, so he's really eager to get Vue support. And so that'll probably be the next one. Once we get those three, though, we probably won't work on anymore. In practical terms, I know Twitter makes it seem like Svelte and Solid.js are like enormous projects that everybody's using. There are so few people using those projects relative to React and Vue. So yeah, we're not really, that's not like a huge goal for us to support a bunch of frameworks. But once we have the support of those, then people will just be able to look at how we do that and make it work with whatever framework they're using. So you want to use Angular, sure. Look at how we do Vue support and do that. Will that happen before the conf? We are actively working on the framework agnostic router right now. And so I think it's, yeah, pretty possible it could. Yeah, the conference is in June or in May, the end of May. So yeah, it's possible. The loader and action stuff. Yeah, that will definitely, that's like, we're working on that actively right now. So that definitely will happen before the conf. I'm thinking, I mean, I don't like promising stuff, but it's certainly not going to take 5 years. Suspense. Just poking fun. Okay. Yeah, you're gonna need to rewrite that section. Okay.
Well, in their defense, there's only 4 people on the team for that.
Yeah. I mean, but 5 years, there hasn't always been just that.
I didn't say it was a good defense.
Yeah. I mean, it's an insanely difficult problem. They've gone through many iterations. So yeah. Just poking fun. It's all right. Okay, that is it. I've got to go. I hear my kids out there, and I'm pretty sure my wife is gone. So who knows what they're doing. I've got to run. You please stay though, because it sounds like Eric and Taylor want you to stay and chat about stuff.
Yeah,
but I'm
just
gonna
a few
take
minutes. Thank you, Kent. Good luck with the kids. Thank you so much for the